I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to our Friday session of Conversations with Al McFarlane. I'm pleased to have as a guest Dr. Zeke McKinney. And Dr. McKinney is in occupational medicine, I believe. Dr. McKinney, how are you? And thanks for joining us again. You were with us last week, a great program last week. Thank you for being here today.
I'm doing very well, thank you. And thank you for having me again. I really appreciate this opportunity to connect with you and the community.
Well, one of the things we talked about last week was taking time to share the personal stories, the background, the motivations of people like you who are first responders, frontline healers in our community. So I wanted to start with that today and ask you to share your own personal background and what brought you to the service in medicine that you attend right now.
Yes, sir. Well, I think there was a couple of big influences in my life that led me into healthcare. One would be my mom, who worked here as a nurse at Fairview for about 20 years. And prior to that, worked in various nursing capacities, including as a public health nurse out on some of the Indian reservations in Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, my older brother actually is also a physician, went to the University of Minnesota Medical School here like myself. And he certainly was a good role model for pushing me forward.
What are their names? What's your mom's name and your brother's name? I might know them.
My mom's name is Ronnie McKinney. She's not working anymore, so you wouldn't see her out there. And my brother's name is Alex McKinney. He actually just took a position out of state. So he was here until just about a week ago.
Okay.
Our family moved to North Minneapolis when I was about 5 years old. So I started first grade here at Willard Elementary over in North Minneapolis, right off about 12th and Russell. 16th and Russell rather. And so, growing up over there, I think there was a lot of evidence of health disparities and ways in which the healthcare community could probably better engage with the folks there. And I think a lot of that carried me forward into my medical training and really influenced what I wanted to do and how I wanted to practice as a physician.
Were you around other young people in the neighborhood who ended up becoming doctors or health professionals? I know there are a couple of young people, probably your age. I think Dr. Williams. Did you know him?
I don't think so.
Son lived on Plymouth Avenue at about Washburn or Xerxes, but he might be a little bit older than you. I'm not sure.
I was going to say that's right in my neighborhood, but I don't think we ever crossed paths.
Okay. Yeah.
And so no, I don't know a lot of folks from there who ended up going to health professions, though I'm sure there were.
Mm-hmm.
Partially our family moved out of North Minneapolis when I was in 9th grade.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't have as close a look on what was going on with some of my cohort at that time.
Okay. And you did some traveling. The family traveled different places around the country?
Prior to moving to Minneapolis, though since that time we've been here.
Mm-hmm.
Just because of sort of our own living situation. We ended up moving to Brooklyn Center when I was in 9th grade. And then the year after that, my parents moved to St. Anthony, though actually I went out of state for high school to boarding school actually for the last 3 years, even though all my older siblings had graduated from Minneapolis North.
North High, okay.
Yes, sir.
Great. North Side Polars, right?
That's right.
And when did you set your sights on becoming a physician? How did that materialize?
Pretty early on. I mean, it was something that I had been talking with my parents and my siblings about even from maybe elementary, middle school.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of carried me forward through high school. I took a little bit of circuitous route to get there.
Mm-hmm.
I graduated high school in 1999. So that was right when the internet was starting to peak in our society. I was really interested in computers as a kid, so pursued a degree in computer science, and then took a couple years after college just to work before I went back to medical school. And actually have tried to integrate some of those skills into medicine. So when people hear about that, they say, oh, gee, well, if you were doing that, what made you want to be a doctor? And I say, well, no. I always wanted to be a doctor. I just did that because it was contemporary and, a good degree to have. And honestly, even as a physician or in a bunch of other positions, everybody says, oh, you have a degree in computer science?
Mm-hmm.
And they get pretty jazzed up about that.
Mm-hmm. And so forming this idea of being a physician, what went into that? Think back to when you were, what 7th grade or 3rd grade, 5th grade? When did the idea of the possibility of being a physician sort of implant itself in your mind?
I think it was even earlier than that. I had my grandparents, I think, were very educationally oriented.
Mm-hmm.
And, as a kid, I had a lot of older siblings who were teaching me a lot. So everybody thought I was a little smart guy then. And, my grandma used to call me the professor. So I think high educational attainment was always something pushed forward in me by my family.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea of being a physician was something sort of in my mind even as long as I can remember. What that really meant, I don't think actually manifested until I was much older.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you're a kid, you think, I want to help people, I want to heal people. But what does that mean in practical reality, I think didn't really become solidified until I was much older.
Mm-hmm. And so as a child, what would you say to yourself or to your friends about being called the professor, or about this idea, the feeling that you had that you probably could and would become a doctor? How did that dialogue play out internally in you?
Sure. Well, I think it wasn't easy to parse all that out as a kid. I mean, again, I think it was evident to me at that time that I was really seeking a high degree of educational attainment, which wasn't always, for most kids isn't necessarily what they're always thinking of. But, my friends always thought I was a geek and a nerd, and, they laughed at that kind of stuff, and that's okay. But what I would tell myself for the past is, don't certainly worry about that, and, go on and keep on what you're doing. But also, I think my friends were proud of me, and, knew that that was kind of where my path was going. And some of those friends I still, talk to this day, and they look to me for, advice about, health and medical conditions and public health. And
Mm-hmm.
especially once COVID-19 came up, I was getting calls from friends I hadn't talked to in years saying, hey man, what's going on with this? Well, what should we be thinking about all that?
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. And so you like science. You said you were into computers. What was the fascination there, and your decision to get the degree in computer science? What was the plan?
Yeah, it was really, it stemmed from the fact that I think I was working with the internet a little bit earlier than a lot of people, even as early as when, maybe 1994, 95.
Mm-hmm.
My mom had internet access through the University of Minnesota through her job. She wasn't using it, but
Mm-hmm.
one of my older brothers showed me how to get onto it with this old rickety computer. And, I could go on there and search for information. And through that, started getting more interested in programming. And at that time, computer science degrees were becoming more available and prevalent. I had some access to some courses at the high school I went to, which was, again, pretty affluent. And so they had some more access to that sort of stuff. And I just felt like it was going to be a good degree, within the College of Engineering that was going to help me no matter what I ended up doing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, on the other side of things, I really like writing too. But, I felt as a black man, I want to get a degree that probably has high practical value.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So don't be a writer.
Well, I don't have to get a degree in writing. I certainly took a lot of English and rhetoric classes, but
Sure.
More just as a sort of avocation than necessarily as my primary degree focus. And I'm not knocking anybody getting liberal arts degrees. I respect you and the media and everybody greatly. I even serve right now as the chief medical editor for Minnesota Medicine, our state's medical journal. And so again, I have no problem with the arts, but again, from just having a degree perspective, and
Mm-hmm.
this would be my advice to any black kid, hey, get a degree that ends in science or engineering.
Mm-hmm. Okay, got it. Yeah, and I was joking too, so no problem. I respect that. So tell me more about growing up. You talked about a family of achievers, parents, grandparents. Talk about your grandparents. Who are they?
Sure. My father's mother and father were from, father's whole family was from Memphis down south, descendants of slaves.
Mm-hmm.
We were kind of nomadic. I think his family mostly ended up in Cleveland a couple generations ago. But even my grandfather, had gone through a lot of pretty significant barriers, even though he was a very intelligent man and educated. I remember a story my dad told, and I don't know if I can tell it perfectly, but I'll do my best, where he had gotten a job for, I think, NBC out in New York,
Mm-hmm.
Working for NBC News or something. And so, they had interviewed him remotely, and he shows up there and they said, whoa, you're black? Why didn't you tell us that? And all of a sudden things fell through.
Mm-hmm.
But even my grandfather actually had done some work with computers. He worked actually at Unisys and Univac here in town,
Mm-hmm.
doing technical writing and things of that nature. My grandmother actually had been involved.
What was his name? What was your granddad's name?
Also Alex McKinney Jr.
Okay.
My dad's the third. My older brother's the fourth.
Okay.
And he had done some technical writing, like I was saying, and my grandma, who had studied at Case Western, actually had done some early work with computers there too, as well, back when they had punch cards and things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
So, and my older brother, one of my older brothers is a pretty significant engineer and was into computing too. So I had a lot of influences pushing me in a lot of different directions. And I'm really fortunate that there were so many people before me who really lifted me up to be where I am. And to be honest, the lesson there was always, if there's more I can do to help the people coming behind me, whether it's in my own family or, right now in medicine, residents, medical students, pre-medical students, high school students who are even interested in the health professions, that's something I try to do as much as I can.
What about your mom's side of the family? That was your dad's side. What about your mom's lineage?
Yeah, so my mom is actually of Eastern European Jewish heritage, and so her two parents, one of them had moved here just as a young child, a few years old, and one of them was born here soon after their parents had moved here. So they were from sort of the Russia-Poland border.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a straight up black Jew, like, Rashida Jones or Drake or whoever. I'll go so far as say, black and Jewish, you can call us bluish. But in any case, I think those are actually two different cultures that have a very rich history. And actually, interestingly, in the United States, the Jewish and black populations have had a lot of very interesting interactions, even in North Minneapolis, which was historically Jewish before becoming primarily African-American.
Right. So how connected to your Jewish legacy and heritage are you? How do you maintain that connection? How far do you, how can you, how do you handle that?
Yeah, I'd say I don't think I'm as connected to it as I would like to be. Actually, we were raised Methodist, which was more from my father's side of the tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a lot of things in Jewish culture and heritage that, I think are worth taking away from that. I've always been interested in Yiddish. I don't know a lot of it, but I'd like to. I can make a mean potato pancake. But ultimately, I think when people think of the stereotypical Jewish mother, I definitely got that. But at the same time, got the stereotypical, Southern black father. So it was an interesting mix in our house, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. And do you know your grands on your mom's side?
I do. All my grandparents now have passed away, but I did know them as a kid. Mm-hmm. And, my grandfather was pretty interesting. I remember the last time I really spent some time with him, he was living in the Bay Area, and I went out there and he was doing some work with the Gray Panthers, and he was always very interested in community engagement. And that's one thing I remember a lot about him.
Activist, radical, or
I don't want to get too deep into it, but yeah, definitely I would say he had some activism going. Mm-hmm. But that was something I think was good for me to see. Even me as a kid, he took me out there and had me stuff in envelopes and things like that. And I think that those are the important kinds of experiences that parents and grandparents can provide to young ones to let them know, look, it's not just about you. It's not just about taking care of yourself. It's really important to be out there in community and doing what you can for folks.
I tell people that, my story, Dr. Zeke, is that my mom was from Mississippi, right? And the family in our storytelling fled Mississippi at night because they were sharecroppers, had owned land that was productive, and her father was murdered. And he was, first of all, challenged by some, like white night riders because he was perceived to be an uppity Negro. And they came to his house one time with the intent of killing him. But his oldest daughter came out and kind of stood him down and, got them to reconsider. They said, let's go this old crazy N-word, we'll get up later. And then sometime later, they sent somebody back who was supposedly a friend, might have been black, and gave him a drink, and the drink killed him. So they poisoned him, right? And so then their situation became one where they were not self-sufficient, where they ended up being sharecroppers and not owners, and had to, I am told, kind of sneak out of by bus at night, one by one, over a period of time. That's the family story. But I bring it up to say that my mom ended up working in Kansas City at a dry goods store, and it was like Myers Dry Good, a Jewish family, and the Jewish families were part of the black community. And so I think back that she, by the time I was born, was able to speak Yiddish. So she spoke. So, and we ended up buying a grocery store from one of the families that she worked for. We owned a grocery store, but she would talk back and forth, probably just phrases, not fluency, but the idea of these cultures being together, that your story reminds me of that. Yeah.
Very much so. Yeah. And, honestly, some people, when they meet my parents, they say, "Oh, I didn't realize your mom was white." And I said, "She's not white. She's Jewish."
Uh-huh. There we go. There we go. There we go.
And trust me, that's a point of great debate amongst even Jews. So I wouldn't go there too much if you can avoid it.
Sure, I understand, but it's an important discussion. And it's important now as the question of identity
Yes, sir.
looms large with all of us around the country. And the question of identity is one of the elements that goes into the debate around justice and around the challenges being illuminated by the death, the murder of George Floyd. And the whole question of Black people now saying, I can't breathe, or I'm looking to pursue and effect a shift and a change in the process of criminal justice that has to do with identity. It has to do with how the existing order values and ranks life. And one could say that the lives of Black people consistently marginalized and devalued. And even in your profession, there are stories about medicine not believing that Black people experience pain the same way white people do. So there's a disparity in how remedies, treatments, et cetera, are meted to Black people versus to white people. Do you hear that at all? What's your thought about that?
So first of all, I can tell you I've heard a million of those stories, and actually it's even more than stories. There are medical literature that completely support very much of that. So that's not something that people are just kind of saying or being paranoid. There's a lot of truth to that completely. And so when Black people, approach the healthcare system with a bit of trepidation or anxiety, I think some of that is very well founded. Mm-hmm. And as a clinician, I have to approach people sensitively in that way. In fact, I just had a Black patient yesterday, and I had a Black resident working with me. And so, when we were talking to her, it seemed like she was a little bit anxious. I said, "Hey, look, at the end of the day, you got about the only 2 Black doctors in the building here. So, I mean, this is the best I can do." No, but in reality, one of my colleagues, actually a white physician, a palliative care doctor, was telling me about one of his first weeks as a palliative care fellow. And they were going on
palliative care is end-of-life care, correct?
Yes, sir. And I apologize. I shouldn't maybe use too many technical terms. So palliative care is especially definitely focused on end-of-life care and, respecting the wishes of people as they approach the end of life. And it's increasingly becoming a growing field as, human beings on Earth are living longer and longer. And that last stage of life is sometimes the most ill and the most prolonged and the most complicated. And so there's certainly a need for docs there. In any case, so he was on one of his first weeks on service there as a fellow, and he said they were going through the hospital, and the other residents were presenting these cases, and they had 4 white patients and 4 Black patients who were in the hospital there. And as everybody was presenting the cases about the Black patients, they said, well, yeah, these folks are, not all as a group, but individually just kept saying, well, this is a difficult patient because of this, and this is a difficult patient because of this. And so my buddy said he went back through and saw all these patients themselves and said, really, with the exception of one person who maybe had some severe mental health issues and was difficult for that reason, the other 3 people had genuine concerns that weren't really being addressed. In fact, one guy, had really bad lung issues and couldn't breathe, and that's why he was uncomfortable. And rather than them stopping to hear what his concerns were or his anxieties around that, they just said, oh, well, this guy's, grumpy and difficult and things like that. And we hear a lot about that, even outside of medicine, where, certainly as a Black man, if you speak up more strongly, or if you are more outspoken or more strong in your personality, people will be taken aback and be concerned about that. Women get some of the same thing too, both Black and white. And so it's trying to address how we approach everyone individually. I think that's kind of the issue, and breaking down some of these stereotypes or these heuristic misconceptions that we have.
I'm Al McFarlane. This is Conversations with Al McFarlane. Our Friday session, we call it Serving the Underserved. And we connect with members of the Minnesota chapter of National Medical Association, NMA. And my guest today is Dr. Zeke McKinney, who is a his specialty is occupational medicine. Tell me what that means. What is occupational medicine?
Yeah, that's a great
question. Can I call you Zeke?
So, please do. I save doctor for the patients.
Okay.
So really, you can call me Zeke. You can call me Dr. Zeke. You can call me McKinney, whatever makes you comfortable.
And you can call me Al. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Not sir.
So,
just Al. Okay.
Yes, just Al. Yes, Al. So occupational medicine is in an interesting field. It's actually the more sort of commonly used term is occupational and environmental medicine. And believe it or not, this is a specialty not only not well known by the public, but also not well known by doctors. I didn't hear about it for the first time until the year I was just had gotten out of medical school. And that was when I suddenly realized, hey, maybe this is something I want to do. So it's all about environmental hazards. If the thing you come across at work, they're occupational. If they're things you come across outside of work, they'd be considered environmental. Sometimes those are the same things. So a majority of what we see are musculoskeletal injuries. So, somebody lifts a box or cuts their finger or something at work. And that same stuff can happen at home. So we deal with a lot of neck, back, shoulder, knee injuries all day long. However, it's a much more broad field. Classical occupational diseases that people think of are lung diseases. With relation to asbestos, silica, beryllium, things like that. We don't see as much of that here in the Twin Cities. Maybe more up on the mining range, you'd see some of that. And those diseases take, 10 or 20 or 30 years to develop, so they can take a long time to manifest anyway. We see occupational asthma a lot more commonly now. There's a lot of occupational skin diseases, occupational dermatitis. So people get rashes, from exposures to chemicals or different soaps or things they might come across at work. There's eye issues. A common thing we see is, people who are grinding metal and get a metal fragment in their eye, and we got to wash that out. Or somebody who's cutting wood for the parts department and, gets a piece of wood in their eye, things like that. We got to do stitches for, cuts on the hand from guys who are working in machine shops. But we do have crush injuries, burns. It's the whole really full spectrum. The other side of it is, we are specialists on workers' compensation, which a lot of people don't understand until they had to deal with it. But that's a separate insurance plan from, your standard health insurance, and it's usually paid for by your employer. Actually, almost always is, depending upon the number of employees. You got to have above 10 employees before you start really, I think, doing things like that and covered by OSHA. But in any case, it's existed for about 110 years. And the reason for it was, if somebody got severely injured in a factory, maybe they'd be so injured that they couldn't go back to work, or maybe they died. They or their family would sue a company, and then maybe the company would go out of business. Well, they found out that this was just bad for everybody for things to go down like this. And so workers' compensation insurance is actually designed to pay for medical care. It's designed to pay for replacement of wages, vocational rehabilitation if somebody can't return to work. And then the last part is what's called permanent partial disability. And that's essentially a legal assignment of whole body disability as terms of a percentage based on the injury. And so the easiest way to understand that is, a guy's at work and gets his pinky finger cut off, and he can go back to work and do his whole job. He doesn't have any problems. That heals well. He got paid for the time he was out of work. But then they will still pay you for the fact that you no longer have a pinky finger.
Right.
Now, do they pay enough for that? Probably not. But it's more than nothing, and it's in addition to all these other things. So it's not a perfect system. I'd say Minnesota's is better than average based on some of the availability of services we have. But, there's always room for improvement. And the challenge is, of course, insurance companies can deny somebody's workers' compensation claim, and that's when attorneys get involved and things like that.
At the end of the day, several parts of the system or the process are served. One, you protect and support the individual, the worker, right, and ensure that he or she receives some compensation or care that he probably couldn't afford, and certainly couldn't afford after he's out of the income producing activity where he was injured. And as you said, this also prevents or minimizes the likelihood that a company, through lawsuit or through costs associated with occupational hazards, will have to shut down and have the ripple effect of maybe X number of people not working because of the cost of attending to the one person and his or her expense associated with their injury. So there's a system in place to try to spread those costs out and to mitigate, but also keep a viable occupational and product going at the same time. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And you brought up an important point. So historically, they call workers' compensation an exclusive remedy. And the point of that term is that by being covered under this system, then you essentially are exempting the company from litigation about that injury. Now, you still can sue somebody if there's like extreme negligence, or of course, if they deny your claim, then things get, like I said, litigious there. But the whole point was to exactly avoid all these very significant outcomes for employees and employers. And so, unlike most doctors who really primarily just focus on the physician-patient relationship, kind of one-dimensional thing, we actually interact both with employees and employers. And so, some people will say, oh, well, this employee doesn't want to get back to work. They're trying to game the system. And I'm not cool with that. And you'll hear people say, oh, this job is trying to abuse me and kill me. And I'm not cool with that either. So we generally approach it from the perspective of, work is healthy for people. I mean, I know if somebody told me I couldn't work, I'd have a problem with that. And ultimately, everyone's goal is the same, to get the person happy and healthy and return them to whatever it is they were doing before, not just at work, but at home. So you can, go play with your kids, or, go shoot basketball or mow your lawn or whatever it is you want to do. So we're really functionally oriented more than most people.
Does mental health come into your equation as well? What's the relationship between you and the your patient or the worker's mental state and the impact on their sense of self, sense of well-being?
That's a hugely important question. I'm really glad you brought it up. It's actually a complicated one. So obviously, I'm not a specialist in psychology or psychiatry, but it does interplay with what we do because, as you mentioned, people's identity is very much tied into their work. And so, let's say somebody has a severe back injury and can't return to what they're doing, they might be out of a job for months or years, and that can be a real problem. And so engaging psychologic services to help people with work-related injuries is really important. The challenge is, it's very hard sometimes to get that covered by workers' compensation, because they would say, well, what exactly does that have to do with the injury? It gets even more complicated when you talk about non-physical injuries and then non-physical impairments. So for example, we've heard about active shooters in recent years, somebody coming into a workplace and maybe shooting it up. Well, let's say you weren't even a person who was physically affected by that, but you just saw this happen in front of you. And of course, that's very traumatizing. And maybe you develop some type of behavioral health condition as a function of that. Well, that's been historically very hard to cover under workers' compensation. Nowadays, PTSD is in fact covered, and that's about the one thing that is. Otherwise, it really is if you have a physical injury leading to a mental impairment, or actually a mental injury leading to a physical impairment, and that can happen too. Those are easier to cover, but still in general, it's very hard to get those services covered. But a good example I had, and this was actually a pretty interesting case. A guy was working as a carpenter, or like in a carpentry shop, sawing wood and stuff. And even though they had machine guards that were there to protect the worker from, kickback of boards and things like that, when he cut it, a big shard of wood shot out of there and hit him in the abdomen. And this guy had to have surgery and had some problems with the scar there for a long time. And then afterwards had a lot of anxiety about returning to that workplace. And so working with a psychologist, they wanted to try to get him to go back, periodically. Okay, maybe just drive to the parking lot and, then do that for one day. And then maybe another day go back and actually just, go up to the building. Anyway, so it got to the point, well, he got on site, and every time he heard the sound of this one saw, he said, he just really got freaked out. And so it turned out this guy couldn't go back. But you see things like that a lot that can be problematic, and helping people sort of face those challenges is one of the things we have to do. And so I've actually given some talks to the psychiatry residents here in town about how do we both interact with each other, when they have work-related stuff, how we can help them, or if we have work-related stuff, how they can help us. And it's a really important issue to deal with. And in fact, so one of my foci or areas that I focus in my practice is with first responders, police, fire, and EMS. And they have much higher than average rates of PTSD and much higher than average rates of suicide. And so, again, even though I'm not a behavioral health expert, understanding the interplay of workers' compensation and how that impacts their job and other aspects of their health is really important too.
You mentioned the case where a person needed surgery to have the shard removed. Are you a surgeon as well, or do you do that part? Or do you refer patients to surgery?
No, sir. So primarily folks in my field, occupational environmental medicine, we call it OEM. We do primarily outpatient care. So we see people in the clinic. So we don't even do work in the hospital. So one thing people like about our job is no nights, no weekends, no call. I mean, I still do take calls and do a lot of work at home,
right.
but I'm not in the hospital then, thankfully. I did do a general surgery and trauma surgery internship at Hennepin County Medical Center before going into my field, but I don't have the training of a surgeon by any means.
And what then would you say is the principal difference between a general or internist and you as a specialist in occupational and environmental medicine?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question too. So internal medicine, I think, is primarily focused on the pathology or the processes inside the body. That's what I call internal medicine, that lead to more complex medical conditions. And so an internist is generally not a surgeon. They actually call them medicine doctors. So those are the folks who are treating people in the hospital and doing a lot of that work. They work in outpatient settings as well. Some people would argue that my specialty should be called external medicine because we deal with some of the external factors and hazards that impact people, and of course leading to internal pathologic processes. So I would say your internist is your kind of general hospital-based, for the most part, primary care doctor, whereas we're again more specialized, just in the sense that we have to deal with some of these medical and legal issues, some of these more complex occupational diseases. One aspect of our specialty that I didn't mention was toxicology, simply because workers are exposed to a lot of chemicals and dusts and molds and things like that. And in fact, that's really my area of clinical expertise, environmental toxicology. People are exposed to lower levels of these things and potentially get weird or unusual health consequences from them.
You mentioned the mental health stressors of first responders, and it just brought to mind that I talked yesterday with one of my colleagues and business customers who said his son is 19 years old, but he's an EMT. And so we're just talking like two dads talking before we stopped our business, right? And he was saying, yeah, my son is in St. Paul in Woodbury, and his workplace includes a couple of those nursing homes that have had a high impact of COVID-19. And in fact, in the past 2 or 3 days, he said 3 of the 8 people he's moved from the nursing home to ICU or to hospital have died. So I'm imagining, and the father is saying to me, my kid loves this work, he loves what he's doing, the helping, but we're wondering how we talk to him so that he stays balanced and does not become PTSD, post-traumatic stress, right, disorder. And so how do you do that? How do you work with people who are first responders, firemen, ambulance drivers, officers, police officers, and others, so that they can do their work, but also not be sickened or harmed by the work they're doing?
That's a really good question too. And to be honest, it has a lot of parallels to medicine, where we've seen a lot of burnout and a lot of problems with some of these same sorts of issues over time also.
Doctors too, right? Doctors have the same, yeah.
And in both, in first responders and in healthcare, there's a big culture of, I just don't really want to talk about it or don't really want to go there. I mean, I think it's getting better in all facets right now, but certainly, like, for example, in the fire service and the police, these are and again, there are women in the fire service and the police, so I'm not just talking about men, but these are more, sort of macho or more, tough professions where, people say, oh, well, I'm just going to just take all that in and I don't need to, I don't need to go see anybody. There's nothing wrong. But I think what they're finding out more and more is some of the issues that individually they're having, their colleagues are having too. So one way in which different departments nationwide have been working on this is trying to do more peer support. So, you're talking to the people who are out there in the field with you. They have the same types of experiences. And, knowing that others have gone through that, I think can help normalize it a little bit and help it feel okay to go get help when you need it. So that's, I think, been one really good thing. There's starting to be more expertise amongst behavioral health professionals focusing specifically on first responders, and more awareness that this is a bigger problem in that population than, in the general populace. I think otherwise there are also concomitant or coexisting factors related to the job that make this worse. For example, firemen, like full-time firemen, often do 24-hour shifts. And so They have a lot of sleep disruption, and of course, that's going to amplify issues of mental health.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of times they're eating on the job, and if they're really busy, they're not always going to be eating the best, and that can, again, affect mental health. Exercise can affect it too, and again, while most of these folks are in really good shape, again, because they have these really tough schedules, sometimes they don't get as much exercise as they would like,
Mm-hmm.
and that can be challenging as well. So there's all these different layers of how mental health and aspects of the job, and I'm talking specifically about first responders, but this would be true for all jobs, including my own,
Mm-hmm.
play into each other. And, you know, as we've learned more and more over time, you know, physical and mental health go together hand in hand, and you can't have one doing very well without the other.
So how do we transfer the awareness about the interrelatedness of mental health and physical health, and the need to pay attention to it and to have access to people that can walk you to and walk you through it? How do we translate that awareness for the profession to an awareness for the community? What do you mean? In our community, I believe that we carry this stigma of not wanting to seek mental health advice or to be perceived as mentally ill, you know, and so that's, and then that expands out to our reluctance to visit doctors in general. I think in some cases, how do we change the culture in the Black community so that our culture is attuned to and receptive to engaging the healing arts, the medical arts, on a not on a emergency basis, but on a proactive basis? How do we do that? I think that's what we need, and it has to do, I believe, Dr. Zeke, with the idea of us developing a framework, a mental idea of ownership of our health, our space, our identity, and our opportunity, and to feel that we have some kind of, what's the right word? It's not equity, some kind of, well, I can't think of the right word, but some kind of basis in that is fundamental, and well, the word will come to me in a minute, but there's got to be a way to have us feel differently in ways that support and allow us to be conscious, aware of the tools and resources and things we can do to stay healthy and get healthier. What do you think?
Well, first of all, I just commend you because I'm so impressed with that line of questioning. I mean, you brought up about 10 really good points all at once, and so I'm going to do my best to try to follow along.
Okay.
I wish I'd been taking better notes as you spoke there. First of all, you know, about being proactive, I mean, one thing I think is worth mentioning is my specialty, occupational environmental medicine, is a specialty of preventive medicine, which is not, you know, the case for everything else that we know in sort of Western medicine. The three specialties would actually be general preventive medicine and public health, occupational environmental medicine, and then aerospace medicine. And the interesting thing about those fields is they actually do have a lot of public health training. They're required to get a master's of public health during their residency training if you don't already have one. But why is that important? I'd say, you know, a lot of Western medicine as we know it focuses on you're sick today, we treat you today, we'll see you next time. And prevention or being proactive, as you mentioned it, is really a super important thing. And so then the second half of that point would be, you know, how do we take ownership of this ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, one issue that's really big and is way outside the Black community is just the fact that as a society, people have perceived, you know, issues of mental health as somebody being weak
Mm-hmm.
or being broken or, you know, not being okay. And I think a cultural acceptance widely that, hey, somebody having anxiety or depression or whatever it is just the same as somebody having, you know, the flu or coronavirus or strep throat, you know, things that, again, aren't their faults necessarily, aren't something that's wrong with them as an individual, but things that, you know, we have medical treatments for and can do things about.
Mm-hmm.
As we're aware of in the Black community, of course, there are plenty of reasons to be hesitant about engaging healthcare in general, and I think that hesitation is only amplified when it comes to mental and behavioral health in the way you described. So now, as far as solutions, you know, I've seen one good thing done recently just in the medical community. I heard about a residency program just the other day that is having their incoming residents all meet with a psychologist just right up front, regardless of whether you're asking for it or not. In fact, you'd have to tell them specifically, I don't want to do that to get out of it. And I think to some degree, that's something we could implement at a society level, you know. Hey, just like you have your annual physical with your regular primary care doc, you can have an annual visit with a psychologist. Now, I don't know if we have the bandwidth in psychology to do that. I mean, right now, it's generally very hard, on the order of a month or two wait to get to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. But certainly, I think making it sort of built into the system. So it's like, oh yeah, I'm just going to see my psychologist for my annual thing. And everybody's like, no big deal, because I did that and everybody did that. And so I think those are ways in which you can integrate it. Whether or not, you know, how do you do that at a level of society that might be too big? Maybe you can do it at the level of an individual workplace. And so, you know, one thing about my field is we've figured out over time that the workplace is a great way to intervene on a lot of health conditions. So a good, not mental health aspect example of that is there's a ton of literature in the occupational medicine space showing that the workplace is a great place to intervene on smoking. And interestingly, in the past decade, we've seen a few employers, well, maybe more than a few, actually take a hard line on smoking and saying, well, we're going to test individuals for smoking tobacco at the time of employment and periodically. If we found out you are, then you're cut from the job.
You're right.
And one of a very wise physician in my field in front of our House of Delegates at our national conference, and this guy ended up being our national president the year later, had said, hey, as a field, the American College of Occupational Environmental Medicine should probably say we're against this. And not everybody agreed with this, but I did. And he said, the reason is if you end up cutting these people out of the workplace, we've just lost our best opportunity, if we want to get people to stop smoking, to do so.
Right.
And then the rationale that employers are using is, well, oh, you know, we're doing this for, you know, people's health and to, you know, better society. But in reality, they were doing it to cut their insurance rates. And that was a lot disingenuous too. So again, I'm just making the point that there are systematic changes I think we can make. And sometimes it's better to do it with more of a carrot than a stick approach. But I think we still have a long way to go, just in terms of cultural acceptance that, hey, this is something we all deal with. And to be honest, I mean, you know, Black and brown people in this country, I think, have a baseline level of anxiety in day-to-day interactions that now we're becoming a little bit more open to talk about, especially since the George Floyd incident, because I think we're getting the message from people, hey, they want to hear about it. I wish they wanted to hear about it before.
Shouldn't and couldn't that be a rationale for increasing the ranks of professionals? The need to have more counseling, more attention, more direction, more feedback. It seems to me that, you know, like you said, you don't know what the bandwidth is, how many hours of capability exist among the professionals. But wouldn't it be desirable to talk about quadrupling or doing something astronomical in terms of bringing people in who are trained and making care, baking it into the culture, either at school or at job or at church or at the grocery store? I mean, there must be all kinds of ways to have people interact, you know, so that, or neighborhood block clubs. How could you figure out a way to have more health, mental health, medical services available to people in more places, with the ultimate aim being providing people with a sense of normalcy, access, confidence, and a sense of, again, ownership, that they can use their natural movement as and that it is arranged in ways that give them the feedback and the tools they need to be healthy moment by moment, day by day, and in every way they present themselves. What do you think about that?
I think that would be wonderful. You know, to be fair, I can't say that I'm an expert on the reasons that we don't have more behavioral health professionals. I mean, there is certainly a physician shortage in the United States, and I know reasons for that. But in either case, yes, I think we could increase access to the pipeline of just training people. I mean, there are certainly more than enough people who are interested in becoming a physician, but there aren't enough spots out there, and there aren't enough residency spots out there, and that's for a number of reasons. Does the same thing exist for, you know, people getting master's or PhD level psychology degrees? I can't say, but certainly I'd be in favor of it. You know, one aspect of it is also, you know, how many people in these fields look like the communities who need them, and that's an area that we're working on. You know, so here in the Twin Cities, we have a, you know, black population of 20-25%, but the physician population, black physicians, is probably closer to like 2-4%. And so, you know, I mean, I can tell you when I was in medical school here, we have one of the biggest medical schools in the country, there was not a lot of black people in the class. And is that a fault of the university, or is it a fault of the system? Is it a fault of the fact that, you know, highly qualified black professionals ain't trying to move to Minnesota? I don't know. We can argue a lot of reasons for that. But I do agree with you that being able to push these resources into places in the community, you mentioned a great number of them, schools, churches, whatever, will be wonderful. I think the challenge is we're already facing sort of the opposite problem, where they've been pulling health professionals out of schools since I was a kid. So, you know, how do we get things like that back in there? That I'm not so sure of. I think it does require, you know, health professionals getting out there and telling people, look, it's okay to seek help. And by the way, you're going to have to take some ownership of this, because the only person who can really change your health for you is you. So interestingly, the first principle of medical ethics is what they call patient autonomy, meaning that a person is in charge of themselves and their health. And I take that to heart, and I talk to patients about this all the time, because I want people to know, when you're in the office with me, I'm not the boss, you are. You know, you're not gonna be able to force me to give you something I don't want to, but similarly, I can't force you to do what I want you to do either. So I have to approach everybody from the perspective of what's your actual goal? You know, if you wanna quit smoking, but you don't want to take your blood pressure medication, well, let's figure out how to make that happen for you, or whatever it is. I'm just giving an arbitrary example. And the same thing is true, I believe, in the behavioral health space. And honestly, I think we need to get Dr. Dion Hart on here, the president of the Minnesota Association of African American Physicians, because she is a psychiatrist, and she could probably speak to all this a lot better than I can. But at the end of the day, I think, as you've identified correctly, ownership in one's health, whether it's physical health or mental health, is a big aspect of this. And I think health education is a big part of that. You know, one thing that I'm extremely passionate about is getting health education out to the community, not just the, you know, the black community, but everybody. And again, that's an area where we've been taking away resources since I was a kid. You know, I mean, I always joke about the fact that, you know, doctors get frustrated because patients seem like they're not really sure why a doctor's asking them certain questions, or why we're doing stuff in the exam room. But I'd make the point that, well, how are they supposed to know? A lot of people don't have any sense of that. And one of the simplest things we could have done in health education was explain to people, here's what a doctor's visit looks like. Here's why they're asking you about, you know, smoking, or why they're asking you about gun ownership, you know, issues of public health that actually will impact your health or the health of people around you. You know, in Florida, they banned doctors from being able to ask about gun ownership, which is a funny thing to do. But again, this is where these discrepancies in between, you know, what we believe as a society are appropriate for personal and public health, and what individually we're comfortable with, those things are pretty different.
Dr. Zeke McKinney, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. This has been a wonderful conversation. I'm getting to know you, and I thank you so much for sharing your personal story, your personal approach. I'd like to do more of this. You know, the idea, I mean, it comes to me that what you're talking about in part is educating the consumer, educating the patient, so that he or she can be the captain of his her own ship, and to be in control of their life, their health, and to look at the physician as a resource and as a tool, not mechanical, but as a resource to help them become and be their best self. And I think that's an important discussion for our entire community. Well, thank you so much today. If you're listening to this program, we're recording it now for Playback later today on Facebook and on YouTube. But if you like it, do that, like it, share it with your networks, and join us again next week, Friday, for Serving the Underserved. Thanks to the Minnesota delegation of the National Medical Association, and thanks to you, Dr. Zeke McKinney. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me, Al.
All right, take care. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.